Welcome to Idea's first ever podcast. Today we have a very special guest with us, Phil Leckie, who is the principal engineer at Chivas Brothers, principal mechanical engineer at Chivas Brothers. So Phil, thanks for coming and joining us. As you know, we're a big advocate of sharing engineering knowledge in the industry across different sectors, different disciplines that we do as a process-led design consultancy. And we share a lot on LinkedIn and website, a lot of thought leadership articles. And with this podcast, we have decided to take it up a notch. So it's a new way of sharing that knowledge with our audience, with our clients, or any aspiring young engineers out there who want to pursue engineering, or even working engineering professionals who I feel, especially in the spirit industry, there's a lot of discussion around the spirit character, but what goes behind the scenes, all the engineering that happens, doesn't often get talked about in the public domain unless you go to a conference or somewhere where you get that sort of information or to pick up a publication. So hopefully with this podcast, what we're trying to do is share that knowledge with a wider world. So Phil, I'll hand it over to you. If you could just give us a quick overview of, what your professional journey has been as a mechanical engineer so far.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah.
It's first podcast, so hopefully
first time. It's a first time for Idea. It's a first time for you.
Yeah.
So
in 2012, I graduated with a Master's in Mechanical Engineering from Strathclyde Uni, as you know, because you were a year or two above me.
Yeah.
I joined the oil and gas industry in Aberdeen, working for an oil field services company there. And I did a grad scheme with them, which was a very structured graduate scheme and a great introduction to engineering. Yeah. I did that for over 4 years and then came back down the road to Glasgow, which is where I'm from, and that was always the plan, and joined a company as a sales project engineer, looking at heaters and fans for coal-fired power plants. Yeah. So quite a big change, but still heavy industry. Yeah. Unfortunately, still a declining industry. Yeah. So I left there after a couple of years. It probably wasn't the best career move for me. And then I went to Petrochem at Grangemouth Refinery, which was a lot more like what I'd done in Aberdeen in terms of the engineering work, the level of risk, the sort of way things were set up in terms of procedures and standards. I worked there for a couple of years, did quite a lot of outage work there, which was fast-paced, high pressure, very big work scopes, very short spaces of time, an absolute need to get it right first time. Yeah. It was a great experience, great learning. But then COVID came around and we were very big on EBITDA. And when you could see what was kind of happening in terms of profit, it was the right time to head out of that. And I think obviously it's not in a great place just now. So I'm glad I did. But it was a fantastic experience. I then went and joined an energy from waste company. Mm-hmm. Massively different in terms of culture and pace. Still had some of the same process risks, but much less engineering resource, a lot less expertise and experience, a much newer industry. Companies that tended to come from the waste and recycling sector moved into energy from waste, and very new plants with new technology as well, and all the challenges that brings. That was a very hectic job.
I've seen you in action.
And to be honest, if I hadn't done it, I wouldn't be in the job I'm in just now, because it allowed me exposure to a lot more machinery and the risks associated with that, whereas oil and gas, petrochem, it's mostly about process risk and mechanical integrity. Yeah. A little bit of machinery with pumps, but the risk with pumps is completely different to the risk with heavy duty recycling machinery. Yeah. And from there, I moved to Chivas Brothers, where I am just now. I've been at Chivas for just over 2 years. My job involves both process equipment and machinery. So that was why I was saying I wouldn't be where I am just now if I hadn't had that experience. It really prepared me quite well for it. When I saw the job description, there was a lot of boxes to tick. I definitely didn't tick them all, but that experience allowed me to tick quite a few that probably people with my background might not have always had if they just stayed in oil and gas and petrochemical.
So in your current role, and as I said, when we are sharing knowledge with our audience, there's a different sectors you can come from when you've done engineering, and there are different disciplines. So today, I think it'll be right to say that we'll focus on the spirit industry, where you have spent last couple of years working for Chivas Brothers, and we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into the world of mechanical engineering, which I won't say it's neglected, but process steals all the limelight, as you know, in the process industry. Nevertheless, it's a high hazard industry. So if you have to tell me or tell our audience in very simple terms, what your day-to-day kind of job in the last 2 years working for Chivas looks like as a mechanical engineer.
Yeah, so I have a kind of split role where I'm responsible for the mechanical standards, the writing of them, implementing them, auditing against them, and that's part of my role. That's the principal engineer part, and along with that comes ad hoc requests for support and advice, looking at specific mechanical issues. That's one half of the job, and then the other half is more focused on strategic projects and project delivery, whether that be as a project manager or supporting another project manager as a discipline engineer. I do a bit of both, so it's quite varied. As you know, the whiskey industry doesn't have the same levels of engineering resource as oil and gas, so there's less silos, so you do get involved in quite a bit more.
Quite a wide range.
Yes, yeah.
So again, just for the wider audience understanding, when you say projects in the whiskey industry, what would you be implying? In relation to your role.
So we're implementing change through projects, whether that's a modification to increase production, to make a site safer, to make it more efficient, to have an impact on our carbon emissions. So typically project is implementing a change. And then the project management side of it is making sure that change is implemented safely and according to standards, that it has the right result for the business and for the process as well.
So at IDEA, we have a strong safety culture, and so does Chivas. In fact, every Monday meeting, the very first weekly meeting we would have, we'll start with safety moment. How does your role, based on what you've just explained, affects safety at Chivas?
From a procedural perspective, mechanical procedures are about ensuring people are safe first and foremost, and then ensuring that our assets are managed and maintained for safety and for production. But safety is primary. I think there's probably 3 key areas for safety for a mechanical engineer in a role in the whiskey industry. There's process safety, simply put, keeping it in the pipe, keeping it in the vessel, keeping it in the tank. There's machinery safety, which is keeping people safe from machines. And then the third branch is more nuts and bolts, health and safety of the projects that you work on. So the people that are actually implementing the change, whether it's your own staff or contractors, people building new plant or maintaining plant, that they are actually safe as well.
I think that's good, because when we talk about safety, we're often also trying to speak a common language. And those language generally are guided through the legislative requirements, through standards. What is your take on the legislation, codes and standards side of things when it comes to, obviously safety, but even broadly speaking, when you're trying to bring a change in the whether it's through a new project or you're trying to look at on an ongoing basis any legislative changes that can affect, especially since Brexit?
On the design codes and standards side of things, they're obviously very important to make sure what we're doing is done to the correct design and quality requirements. And sometimes it may be difficult to follow them. It takes a certain type of person to read and understand, for example, a piping code.
Yeah.
That can be a bit challenging, and the temptation is to then not use that resource.
No.
And there's an expectation on companies, whiskey companies, any company working in a hazardous environment, to ensure that everything that they do from a project perspective is done to an appropriate code or standard. One of the sort of unusual ones that are going too geeky into PSSR and Pressure Equipment Directive is the SEP aspect, Sound Engineering Practice, which so much of our process pipe work will fall into under PED, being low pressure, or just not being a hazardous fluid, basically. And that's quite a challenge, because everyone's interpretation of SEP is different. Coming from oil and gas, my interpretation of SEP is going to be different to someone who's come from the power industry. In the UK, we don't really have established codes of practice for SEP from a piping perspective. So sometimes you have to exercise some pragmatism, but still apply, for example, some of the rules and the principles of Cat 1 pipework, just as an example. Going on to the Brexit side of things and UKCA, CE marking, that side of things has been challenging since Brexit, but I think it's probably due to a lack of understanding, which is a result of a lack of clarity on what's actually expected if you're supplying something into the UK or within the UK that falls under one of the European directives. We had a very specific incident recently where a supplier had taken on the role of a manufacturer under machinery directive because they had put a load of components together to make a machine, and they were struggling to provide us with a UKCA mark because some of the components were from Italy, for example, and they couldn't be supplied with the CE because there was no one doing that there at the time. What they didn't understand was that we could still accept the package CE marked. We didn't need to UKCA mark it. We could still use CE, and all the sort of signals we're getting, and you probably have a similar sort of feeling on it, is that CE marking's here to stay, and UKCA may well fizzle out.
I mean, at the moment, there is almost like an infinite timeline in hand. And I saw that rush in the end users, that what does it mean for them, especially the new projects going through where you're about to order a new machine or you're speccing a new machine. And if especially the machine's coming from Europe or outside the UK, it's much more challenging because the supply chain outside the UK hadn't quite get themselves aligned with the requirement, and suddenly everything just dies down. So
I'm not aware of any, certainly mechanically, any statutory instruments that have changed since Brexit that don't still fully implement the European directive. So nothing's really changed for us. One of the other bigger implications of Brexit perhaps is the supply chain side of things, and purely at a logistical level. Getting spares and getting parts from Europe is a lot more difficult, takes more time. Certainly when you're in a fast-paced environment and a piece of equipment goes down, where you used to be able to get a part, maybe something as simple as a bearing or a seal assembly, you could get it overnight, whereas now it's got to clear customs and there's a lot more to it. My tip there would be find a really good logistics handler, someone that really understands the paperwork side of things and can do that for you. That's the key, certainly. In previous roles where we had unreliable plant, we certainly picked up the phone Friday afternoons to our logistics company on a very regular basis.
I think when you generally talk to people, especially coming from outside, they don't quite appreciate the hazardous nature of the spirit, especially when it's produced and it's and it's with higher alcohol by volume percentage. So in a nutshell, we as engineers, whether working as part of the multidiscipline team trying to implement these projects, our job in a nutshell is to make sure this so-called hazardous substance, ethanol, is produced safely, stored safely, and transported safely. So when you look at companies like Chivas and other big, obviously, whiskey producers, they have a lot of manufacturing sites where you're bottling, filling, storing a huge and different variety of spirit. And you also have production sites, which can involve, producing in small quantity or producing in large quantity. So you can have such a variety of assets that generally spans between a production site. But generally, when you talk about a whiskey industry, people might, think of a traditional whiskey distillery with few stills producing spirit. From engineering point of view, when you have to apply these standards, legislations, especially it was quite interesting, you were talking about the lack of resources across very different type of sites. Because if you try and apply different standards in different places, it could be a nightmare to manage. So what do you think should be some of the best practices that you would say anybody listening into it who have just started their distillery, who may have 10 distilleries or other sites going forward, to somebody like Chivas who have multiple sites?
As you alluded to, you might find a warehousing site would quite often fall under top tier, upper tier coma status. And then you might have a distillery, it might be a fairly large distillery with quite a lot of production that won't fall under coma regs because they're based around the storage or the volume of hazardous substance on site. So it's quite interesting because the warehouses are the sort of places that we tend not to do as much work or avoid doing work for obvious reasons. Whereas a distillery, you've got steam, high temperature process, you've got the risk of vapours, and if you take a step back from a process safety perspective, that might seem like the more risky place. Chivas has always had a view that whether it's an upper tier, lower tier or non-coma site, they'll apply the same engineering principles and standards. And that would be the advice I would give to anyone, entering the industry or an engineer entering it. That's been a long-term approach from Chivas. And I think it's quite important because, as you say, if you allow watering down the standards on different sites, then it's very difficult to manage. But also, you can still have very major incidents on non-coma sites.
Yeah.
You just might not have the same potential for a major accident scenario in terms of coma regulations. Yeah. So you still have to be very careful. And the best and simplest way is to have a standardized approach and apply it regardless of the site.
Yeah, I mean, like yourself, I had come from what I would call energy industry, going into the whiskey industry. Did it surprise you the sheer magnitude of assets involved? Because as I said, when I was just a happy consumer of whiskey or other type of spirits, I didn't really appreciate, where some of the companies, they have huge assets, multiple, obviously, machinery, a lot of, obviously, millions liters of, production volumes every year. Does it surprise you?
Yeah. The most surprising thing is when you do the maths and work out how much is in a warehouse versus how much is in a tank farm. Yeah. And the warehouse always blows you away. Yeah. But if you've been in one, you see it's densely packed and you can kind of understand. I still quite regularly ask my colleagues in the bulk operation side of the business, how many casks is it? How many 100,000 does that line do? And it's a really significant amount.
As an industry, it's fair to say that when the industry started a few decades ago, as smaller producers, the main focus was on producing as much as you can from revenue standpoint. Meeting safety standards or complying with regulation perhaps wasn't the top of the priority. But then companies which have accumulated so many of these obviously brands over the period of time, and they have assets, of different types spread across these different type of industry. It's amazing the amount of investment that continues to go into the industry, that it deserves, what the transition we have seen in the last couple of, decades, in the last few years, especially with the increased focus on compliance and the safety side. I think it's fair to say that industry deserves, given how much it's obviously producing and the hazards that obviously come with it. It deserves that kind of focus from engineering standpoint.
I think if you look back at most major industries in the UK and in Europe, worldwide, there's usually events that lead up to stricter regulation. We all know about Piper Alpha and oil and gas.
Yeah.
We know about Bunsfield, process safety events in chemical storage places. Even, going back to bakeries and dust explosions and steam boiler explosions, and then, PSSR regulations come in and, almost as a result of that. So there's always been industries that grow and then they become more strictly regulated.
Yeah.
Coma obviously came in not before I was born, but while I was still younger.
Yeah.
And it applies to our sites, and I think it's probably fair to say that it's being applied more rigorously now than maybe initially.
Or for instance, Desir in the last 10 years.
Yes, yeah. Yes, Desir and the mechanical aspects of Desir is, let's not go into it because I'll show how little I understand about it. But no, mechanical Desir is a great example where it's not widely understood, but it is now much more rigorously applied.
Yeah.
So no, I think it's fair to say that, that there needs to be a focus on safety. But the industry has a good safety record, and there is definitely, from what I've seen in my 2 years working with consultancies and meeting other engineers and other distilleries, there is a real appetite to be as safe as possible.
Absolutely. I think I've seen that transition in the industry.
And in the past, you'll have seen the Purple Book, the SWA's Purple Book. I mean, there was effort, real effort went into understanding Desir.
Yeah.
And that was the bigger companies that had more engineering resource helped develop that with input from the smaller companies. But the aim was to make sure that everyone could understand it, so that if you were a smaller distiller, you could quickly get your head around the risks and become more of an informed or intelligent customer.
Yeah. So you're someone who have transitioned from, you've been a part of energy industry. You worked in energy from waste, which I would kind of put under a renewable category, and then transitioning into the spirit industry. What are the key differences that you would see that, or what are the things that you would say that stands out, or things that you would like to apply based on your previous learnings?
Well, I think if I go back to being a graduate, oil and gas, and then petrochem after that, procedures and standards are incredibly strict. When you're younger, you probably sit and think this is a bit over the top, and there's the old joke of, well, if you go for a quote and you work for an oil and gas company, they'll add a zero on.
Yeah.
But there's a reason for those standards and procedures, and I think, upon reflection, having seen what can go wrong to an extent, those procedures and standards from an engineering perspective allow you to do your day-to-day role according to rules.
Yeah.
And then when new issues come in that require more focus and attention, you can focus on them. And it also means that you don't need experts all the time. If people stick to rules, then in general, within the scope of a standard or procedure, you should be safe. From an operational perspective, we have a lot of procedures and standards, but where we might not have as strict or as many is certainly on the engineering side of things in terms of specifications. And there's a balance there as well, because it is a different industry with different risks. I think we're really lucky in that we don't have many damage mechanisms. So from an integrity perspective, spirit is quite nice for plant to be pumping around. There's no real internal corrosion or damage mechanisms. We use mostly stainless steel on our plant, so we don't need to manage the same integrity risks. However, when you don't have as strict standards and procedures, there is still the risk that things can go wrong, and you can have equipment that's not going to last as well as you anticipate, or potentially going to cause you integrity issues earlier than it should. So there's a financial risk as well as a safety risk if you don't have standards. So I think there's a sweet spot for whiskey, and in some areas we're probably there, taking some of the learnings from oil and gas and the sort of key aspects and applying it, but with a bit of pragmatism and understanding where you can relax some rules because, well, there's not the same risk. I think that's quite key. But we do have aging assets. There's a lot of sites that are, by virtue of the fact that they don't have the same damage mechanisms, running for many years, where you would have replaced pipes and vessels on a normal process plant already. So you find that there is an aging asset piece there that we need to be aware of and understand and manage. The health and safety executives certainly expect you to. It comes, it's part of managing process safety, process risk, and also interestingly pure compliance, because where equipment doesn't fall under PSSR, for example, pure is the regulation that's used to enforce or worse if things are going wrong or things aren't being maintained properly. And pure is really wide reaching. So I think there's a lot of principles from oil and gas that we can take to help satisfy requirements of pure, for example.
So I think it's fair to say that, or conclude what we have been discussing, that while you cannot directly take the standards and from other industry, energy or pharmaceutical, and apply as it is to the whiskey industry, your attitude cannot be that there is no need, because there absolutely is. And I think, as you and I both recognize, an industry has come a long way to put standards in place. However, there's still a long way to go, because you still see, obviously, companies having different sites might still be following different procedures, standards for similar processes, or even within the same industry, different producers who have settled on, different things. So I think there's a wider kind of, need to ensure that there is that consistency. So the whole supply chain can be aligned to ensure that it is understood, because when you're working with different stakeholders, insurers, who are external stakeholders, in some of these cases can have very strong views depending on which background they are coming from.
Yeah, and I think ultimately from a regulatory and health and safety perspective, there is the same expectation across the board. But like you say, you might be speaking to a supplier who goes, oh, well, that's not how they do it.
Yeah.
And there is quite a bit of variance across the industry.
This is how we have always done it.
Yeah.
And nobody said anything.
Or often, one of the bigger operators starts doing it, so people follow suit. And you find that does tend to happen quite a lot. We collaborate quite a lot as an industry, which is really positive. Through the SWA as a prime example, we share a lot of knowledge in terms of health and safety, environmental and sustainability focuses as well. So I think we're getting better as an industry at aligning on things. And it's certainly that's how oil and gas, petrochem, the power industry, that's how they've operated for quite some time, especially when dealing with really difficult and potentially emotive safety issues, where they get together and work out a strategy and collaborate with regulators to make sure that strategy is the right strategy. And I think that's positive. And certainly in the whiskey industry, we do that. Yeah.
Well, we've talked about past and current. Let's go a bit into the future. With all the work that is going around energy transition, decarbonisation, there are technologies, heat pumps, electric boilers, they don't have a lot of, as you know, field experience as such, especially at the size and capacities that are required to basically allow this transition. What are your thoughts, as we adopt these technologies, integrate them with our processes? What are your thoughts on embedding these?
So I work for Chivas, so I can't not mention MVR, Mechanical Vapour Recompression, which essentially takes waste heat from the process.
Sure.
Steam, in this instance, recompresses it up to be usable steam. At one of our distilleries, which we now have an open source case study on, Glentalkers, it's been implemented and resulted in a 48% reduction in energy usage and a 53% reduction in carbon emissions. I wasn't involved in that project directly. It was the Northern Projects team, so definitely won't claim to be involved. But have now become involved in the MVR projects, and they're very interesting. They come with their challenges. If anyone wants to read a bit more about it, you can find the case study on the Chivas Brothers website.
And can I say Chivas have done a great job sharing in an open public forum the knowledge that is gained, which obviously gives confidence to the rest of the industry that, when it comes to integrating such technologies, it's very much doable, and they have realized obviously the energy savings and obviously their efforts towards decarbonization.
Yeah, and that's my colleagues in the north, the making it open source. It was obviously a decision by Chivas that this is too big and too important a problem to not collaborate and work with others on. It's a societal, global problem. It's not about having a business edge. Yeah. It's about making real change. So I think that's really positive. And there's been quite a lot of interest in it. And there's been open days and people have been to the site as well. Yeah. So that's good. And that collaboration is great. It's not necessarily new technology. It's been applied on in other plants in the past. In fact, it was used on distilleries as well, in evaporation plants. Yeah. So it's not new technology. It's a slightly different application. Are there risks with the equipment? Well, it's low pressure steam, so it tends to fall below the pressure equipment directive. So there is that challenge of SEP and demonstrating that your pipework is sound and safe. And from a mechanical equipment perspective, the fans themselves, fans and blowers, we've had them for a long, long time. They're not new. I think what we need to be careful to do is keep quite close with the OEMs so that as they learn about them in this application, we also learn about them and make sure that we get the most out of those assets, applying things like condition-based monitoring where it's suitable to do so. I think if you've done any maintenance engineering, you usually take what an OEM says with a pinch of salt. If they say you need to go in every 6 months and change the bearings, well, you'll probably find that you can do it every year. You know, there's always that applying a bit of experience. So I think when you're looking at newer technologies, you need to focus and follow their recommendations more. Yeah,
absolutely. When it comes to the reliability of these equipment, which are not cheap, by the way, and if there is a breakdown, then how quickly you can get someone to actually get it back up and running.
And it's fairly high capital rotating equipment, which isn't that common in the whiskey industry. In the whiskey industry. And the management of that, you know, there's not as much room for error. Yeah. It's not a boiler that runs non-stop, and usually your PSSR competent person comes in and does an inspection on it, and you get the okay, or you make some repairs. It's totally different maintaining rotating equipment, but we are lucky in that most sites have, like an annual or biannual shutdown, so you can get in and do maintenance, whereas in the petrochem, oil and gas world, you're maybe trying to get 4 or 5 years out of something. So we've got the opportunity to go in and tweak equipment and make modifications and really hone the process. Yeah. I think, don't ask me about heat pumps.
Well, that was going to be my next question, that you've talked about MVR, and MVR is a type of heat pump. While we are seeing a lot of other more refrigerant-based heat pumps that are coming to the market, they're pushing the boundaries, they're pushing the temperatures, the capacities, the kilowatt rating, what I would kind of typically class them as industrial heat pumps, high temperature industrial heat pumps. And there are different type of refrigerants which allow you to obviously achieve different capacities depending on what your application is. And all these things, when it comes to integrating with the current processes, I think the biggest learning for me has been that these can't be the like-for-like replacement for something that boiler could do for you, for instance.
I think it's the same with anything when we're trying to reduce emissions and energy consumption. It's a mix. There's no silver bullet.
Yeah.
Electric boilers are great, but there's a huge power requirement for them, and distilleries aren't typically in places where there's a lot of infrastructure in that regard. So there's challenges, but if you could install an electric boiler and then complement it with heat pumps or MBR, it's going to be a mix and a makeup. Totally dependent on the size of your distillery and the process. I'm sure it's something that IDEA knows a lot more than I do about, and getting that makeup right, because it's going to be different for every operator and every site.
There is no silver bullet. I think that's a key thing. As much as any supplier would like to think that their technology can, single-handedly solve the whole process, it's going to be a mix of technologies, changes in processes that going to, obviously, and there's going to be a pathway. It can't just happen overnight. But coming back to heat pumps and your understanding as a mechanical engineer of process safety risk is quite good. And when it comes to understanding heat pumps, which are coming with their own refrigerants of different type, both natural, but some things like propane, which do fall under DSIR and recognizes hazardous substance, or other type of refrigerants which may be identified as hazardous substance. Now, I am seeing suppliers coming to me and saying, well, it is semi-flammable as a substance, but the equipment itself is not ATIX rated. And that's where, you were talking about obviously having that open line of communication with the suppliers to make them understand the risk, especially if you're adopting them and you might be housing it near the warehouse or other hazardous areas on site, which they might not appreciate. And that's where, obviously carrying out risk assessments and making sure that we are safely embedding these technologies in our processes.
That's a particularly interesting example where you would probably want to have a third party do a hazardous area classification assessment on it to come back to determine, is it really non-ATEX or is there a gap? And suppliers don't always, like you say, fully appreciate where it's going to go and the implications. And if you've supplied a piece of equipment into an industry that typically never falls under DSIR, then it makes sense that they may well have a gap. But I think even with suppliers who have a lot of experience of supplying equipment, sometimes they are surprised, for example, when we say we're going to HAZOP it. And quite often you'll find when you go through the HAZOP and you get that multidisciplinary team and you look at it in your application, that you might spot weaknesses and vulnerabilities that they haven't, and they've been supplying equipment for years, and the likelihood of failure or hazardous scenario might be really low, and that's why they've never experienced it. But when you go through that process, it can be really interesting what it throws up. And I think sometimes suppliers as well can be, not taken aback, but eyes opened a little bit to their own products and the risks associated with them. Yeah, I think it all goes back to, again, the sectors they have been implemented in, because some of these units, heat pumps with the temperature that they can deliver, they've been used in safe areas, mostly hospitals, commercials, where there's a big, obviously, steady load requirement for hot water. But it's not the same when you're trying to obviously integrate them with processes where you're obviously producing, you can have risk of fire and explosion.
and that's where I think there's a gap which we are seeing, in which what suppliers have always supplied, and what, if we as an industry have to adopt these technologies.
It's just like you say, if you're supplying into an industry that isn't typically hazardous, or, in your example, a building services company may well be dealing with the design of that and putting it in. It's totally different to implementing it in a distillery where it might be, interfacing with the process, whether it's through a heat exchanger or whatever. It's a completely different scenario, and the focus that we would put on it is entirely different.
No, thanks, Phil, and thanks for your insight and giving us insight into engineering behind the scenes that goes into, which makes these distillery keep producing wonderful products that we all enjoy. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.